Hello, hi everybody.
All right, John, go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, good morning to everybody, and I think we can begin now. Firstly, I'd like to welcome you all. Thank you everyone for coming, especially at such a short notice for some of you. I know you are all very busy and it is difficult to take time away from your daily task for meetings. So thank you for making the time to come to this webinar. I understand some of you might be hearing about the Coalition for Good School for the first time. So I just want to take advantage of those who are hearing for the first time to briefly speak about the Coalition for Good Schools. The Coalition for Good School convened as a result of conversations of leaders of several organizations in the Global South that works on the prevention of violence against children. Our colleagues from Raising Voice had conducted an informal scanning exercise and had generated preliminary perspectives which showed that there's a lot that is happening in the Global South in terms of prevention of violence against children in school, but remain undocumented, and that most of what was published in the peer-reviewed journal was from the Global North. So the group met for the first time in late 2019 to understand why this was the case and what could be done. We realized we need to do two things. One, we realized that we need to map out what was happening on the issues of violence against children in school in the Global South and who was leading it and what was working. But secondly, we also thought that it is important to develop a platform for sharing and create a community of practice of establishing an infrastructure necessary for this work to engage more fully between peers and on the global stage. So the subject of today's session, which is one to have, the second one will be on 16th June, and the other one will be on 13th July.
I can't hear John.
Sorry. Hello?
Yeah, go on, John.
Yeah, Dr. Pranita, achieved based on ICRC in India. Both are founding members of the Coalition for Good Schools, and I'll introduce them in a minute, the two who are the main speakers of today's session. Pranita works as a director of research and programs at the International Center for Research on Women in Asia office based in India. She brings more than 20 years in applied research and program monitoring, particularly in gender-based violence, adolescent health, and family planning. Pranita has led some of the organization's flagship programs, including the School-Based Violence Prevention Program, International Institute of Population Science in Mumbai, as well as Pranita has led some of the organization's flagship program, including School-Based Violence and Prevention program called GEMS, G-E-M-S. She holds a master's degree in population studies from the International Institute of Population Science in Mumbai, as well as master's degrees in statistics from Banaras Hindu University in Banaras, India. So that is a brief, that is Pranita. And then Shanaz is the director of the Children Institute and a professor in the Faculty of Health Science at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. She has a doctorate from the University of Witwatersrand. She is a commissioner on the Lancet Commission on GBV, a member of International Advisory Board for the UNICEF Innocent Research Office's multi-country study on the drivers of violence, and a managing committee member of the DST NRF Center of Excellence in Human Development at the University of Witwatersrand. Her research interests include the intersection of violence against women and children using an intersectional feminist lens. There's a lot that I could talk about Shanaz, but that is brief about her. And I would like now to before I invite my colleagues, Deepak, to say brief things and also lead on the presentation, lead on welcoming the presenters who are the main speakers. I would like to say that both Shanaz and Pranita are the founding members of the Coalition for Good School. So I would like to stop there and hand it over to Deepak for taking it forward. Thank you very much and welcome you all. Deepak.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that oversight of the coalition and also introducing the speakers. We are very lucky today to have two people who led this work and who have been analyzing it and helping us understand a little bit what is going on. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we would like to have a conversation with both Shanaz and Pranita about the work that they did around just scoping and analyzing the work that is going on in Global South. So my name is Deepak, as John just mentioned, and I'm a co-founder and co-director of Raising Voices that works to prevent violence against women and children, and we are based in Uganda. So let me turn to Shanaz first. Shanaz, thank you for taking on this daunting task. In a way, when we approached you and Pranita for this work, we knew that we were asking a lot of you, that we were asking you to in some ways gather together and put some frame of analysis and understand what is going on in Global South around the issue of preventing violence against children in schools. So perhaps you can start, Shanaz, by telling us a little bit about how you approached this particular task and then how you framed it even in your own mind in terms of how you tackled this task. And Pranita, you can jump into whenever you want.
Thanks, Deepak, for, we met in December 2019, just before COVID hit the globe. And I think, when we had the meeting, and it was about 10 or 11 of us that got together, and the idea of doing the scoping review was raised. I think I didn't realize how mammoth a task it was going to be until we got stuck in it. But what both Pranita and I were clear about is that we wanted to combine rigor. So we wanted to apply rigor to the design of doing the evidence review, but also think about it more broader than the traditional evidence review that you'd see in other publications. For us, it was very important. And as we had these discussions in New York, and it seems so long ago, that voices from the Global South often don't get heard in these discussions, and that for us it was really, really important to broaden our base of not just including what you would traditionally include in a evidence review of just published publications in peer-reviewed journals. That's very standard. So we did go that route, and we did apply that lens. So we went through the process of searching through the normal databases, and we enlisted the help of our, the kind of traditional approaches of scanning through and using our libraries at the universities to get all what's listed in your mainstream peer-reviewed publications. But what we wanted to do also was to get voices from practitioners, and that meant going to grey literature, going through networks and identifying what would not else have been included in a review. And we knew then that the evidence would not be the same, but we would take that into account in our analysis. So we started off with more than 100,000 records, of which we needed to sift through. So you can see it was a huge task, and I've got to also it wasn't just Pranita and I that did this work. We had a group of young people that worked with us to go through all these records, screen titles, screen abstracts, with Pranita and I being in the background, and Pranita can add to this, of providing oversight and really right at the start thinking about what would be the standardized approach that we would use so that we could gather the necessary data from every publication we were looking at. So, I mean, I can talk about the methods for a long time, and I don't think that's why we've got the audience here today, but really to say we then reviewed just over 800 full text articles and reports. And at the end of it, what we did include, so you can see, what was a mammoth task we started off with, we included 151 reports and peer review publications in this review. So Pranita, I don't know if I want to hand over to you here, but for me, it's just still, it seems, how on earth did we get through this daunting task of going through all of this? But, we couldn't have done that if we didn't have the group of really energetic young people working with us. I don't think I've got the energy for this, the kind of scoping that they've done, but, phenomenal group of young people.
Yeah, thank you, Shina. So we'll come in a minute to, how do you make sense of this mountain of information that came your way and then sift it. But one of the things that you mentioned, Shinaz, and then maybe Pranita will have a view on this as well, is that you not only were looking for what was published in peer-reviewed journals and other places, but you were also trying to reach out to things that we don't normally come across. So can you talk a little bit about challenges that you encountered? How did you get to that information that is sometimes hidden in organization data or on their website or in their files somewhere?
So, and yeah, I've got to commend Lauren, one of my colleagues that worked with us on the scoping review, because she was really, really, a task to find the grey literature, and Tavisha from Raising Voices as well. So we used this as our stepping stone, the work that had been done by Raising Voices as a precursor, where there had been some idea of the work that had been done in the Global South in this area, but we also reached out to the global groups network. So the founding members of the coalition, then we reached out to all their networks, and we have to thank the coalition members for allowing us to tap into their networks, because it was only through those networks that we were able to get to the grey literature. And as you can see from this map, that we, in terms of peer-reviewed publications, Sub-Saharan Africa and South and Asia had very similar numbers of publications, but when we got to grey literature, we were probably better networked in Sub-Saharan Africa, because we were able to get a far larger number of grey literature from our networks in Sub-Saharan Africa. So what I'm very clear about is that although we tried as far as possible to get as much grey literature as we could, we probably didn't get everything because we were biased in terms of language, so it was English. And I am pretty sure there are a number of publications in other languages that we did not access, and also networks that we were not able to access. So I see this very much as a start, and I think it's really, really important to see this as a process where we can add on to. And, as we've published this, it's outdated already because there's so much happening out there. So just wanting to put out there that, this was probably true for about 18 months ago, and we probably, if we do a scan now, the landscape would have changed somewhat, but I think the lessons learned is still invaluable.
Yeah, I can see that in some ways, you know, when the task is so big, right, that we're looking at the entire global south, that's a huge region of the world, it's really hard to be totally inclusive. And then especially I'll bias being English, that we really just didn't have the capacity to engage in any other language. So having said those limitations, maybe let's turn to Pranita. That, you know, Shinaz mentioned that you guys started with almost 100,000 records and you narrowed it down to manageable. So can you talk a little bit about what was the sifting process? What was the system that you guys were using to narrow it down so that people can understand and extract some insights from what you were learning?
Yeah, no, thank you, Deepak. And as Shanaz mentioned, that it was a huge Herculean task that we begin with. We were very cognizant of the fact that this is a critical first step in that process. And there are a lot of tons of work that are happening, which may not be part of the peer-reviewed journals which are being captured and presented, because we also recognize and understand that peer review journal has its own way of saying that what knowledge gets space in those documents and what knowledge just remains as part of the different reports. So, I mean, recognizing well, we had begun on the journey, but in the process, we also realized that, you know, how well peer-reviewed journal database are placed, and there's tons of publication and articles which are there. On the other hand, the moment you get into the gray literature, and maybe we need to find some better term even for that, those literature which are not part of the peer-reviewed journal, how difficult and challenging that is to even get it. And in that process, as Sina said, or even you said, that we may have missed out on many, apart from the language barrier that we had, but also just by sheer not able to reach to specific network or organization to do this. So I think it will be really important that everyone who is part of this webinar also can contribute in expanding the database, which are not necessarily part of the peer-reviewed journal, because we definitely intend to feel that over the time we need to expand and bring other literature which are currently not part of this learnings from there also need to be brought in. So, like, you know, as a process of going through, what we had a very clear and had recognized early on, that we need to have a very systematic way and standardized protocol, which includes clear search terms, and also, like, you know, what are the key elements of a program. So, like, you know, for example, any program which is evaluated is something we were looking for. So any article which is more conceptual, which is more related policy or theoretical, we had decided not to include in this review. So as a team, we had put those processes. So like the first step was to like, you know, use a screening or a filter of titles. So like, you know, title which is very clear about the evaluation of a program which is school-based on violence prevention. That is something that we had prioritized on. But then the next was to then use abstracts to further understand what those particular articles are, and then use that to further filter it. And then finally, still, like, you know, what Sena said, without the team of like Lauren and many other colleagues, we wouldn't have really gone through 800 plus articles, which were like, you know, supposed to be read thoroughly, completely before saying, okay, let's not include these articles for X, Y, and Z reason. So we had thoroughly listed all that, you know, why certain articles are included and not included in the process, so that we are not, like, as an individual researchers, introduce certain biases in that. And then finally, we had 151 articles, which then we use for data extraction. So that whole process we followed in this one.
Thank you, Pranita. I mean, I see two kind of things that I wanted to pick up on there. The first is both Shanaz and you kind of started off by saying that one of the intentions of this exercise is to start from a perspective that just because something is not published in peer-reviewed journal doesn't mean that there isn't important insight there, that there isn't important things that we could learn from. Yeah. And so you wanted to include the insights from the front lines where people were kind of experimenting with ideas. Yeah. And then the second part of it is that, you know, you had some minimum standards that you were looking at, that, you know, it wasn't that anything that was published you included, but that there was a way of making sure that it was addressing specifically an intervention, that somebody was doing something and describing it. And those are the things that you review. Yeah. So in a way, once you got a lot of information, how did you organize it? What did you have a framework that you used to kind of sift information and make piles from this mountain that you had? Like Inspire, I know you guys use the Inspire framework. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? How you organized information? Either Pranita or Shanaz.
Shanaz, go ahead. Yeah.
Pranita, you go, and then I can
go
add
ahead.
in.
Go ahead. I was just saying that thing.
Yeah, I mean, we grappled initially with what would be the best framework to use to make sense of the data that's emerging for us. And Pranita and I had to put heads together and say what would work the best, and having conversations with others. And we adapted the Inspire framework. So we used 5 of the areas that I felt, you know, that we could group the information around. So we used, and Pranita, yeah, you've got to help me remember. So one was thinking about, so a number of programs were around life skills. So kind of thinking into that space. And in fact, I think there was a large number. So if we're thinking of, you know, all the programs that's implemented in and through schools, a large number of programs have an element of a life skills approach in it. The other was around norms. So quite a lot of work around norms in schools. The other area is creating safe and enabling environments. And then the other was around psychosocial support for children in and through schools, which is an interesting area given, you know, and particularly with us being through COVID and children having been exposed to trauma at different levels. That was another approach. And then lastly, it was the whole schools approach that we used that doesn't feature in Inspire, but it actually had multiple components added to it. And so we could have called it a multi-component intervention, but it just leaned towards using the term a whole schools approach. So the framework we used in terms of making sense of all this data and hanging together was really around those 5 areas. Pranita, anything that I've missed that you want to add?
No, so it's actually these 5, but you know what we also learned when we were looking at the different programs that we had identified, and there were around 95 programs which we had looked at. Many of those programs had more than one of these strategies into it, but like, you know, in terms of segregation and making analysis more useful for any reader, what we actually consider is like, what is the core strategy that program has used and articulated in their own way in those articles. So that's how we had tried to categorize the programs under these 5 heads, what Shanaz has just mentioned. But like, you know, if you read through the report, you will see that actually each program has more than one component. So like a program which is primarily focusing on addressing harmful gender norms, they have also used knowledge building and skill enhancement as an approach to address harmful norms. So that type of cross-cutting themes you'll find when you read through the report. But yeah, Shanaz has already shared this.
Great. So in some way, in the conversation so far, we've started off with, just saying that we were focusing on the issue of violence against children in schools in Global South. We were particularly looking at practical interventions and how they were working and what people were learning from it. And then, in this final part, we've been talking a little bit about that. It's not like we try to reinvent the wheel, that there's a lot of thinking that people have done, right? And so we were building on it by using the INSPIRE framework. INSPIRE framework is familiar to everyone. And so in some ways, we wanted to link with the thought thinking that has already been done. Yeah? So now let me ask both of you this question, that from all this exercise, what are some of the key insights? What are we learning? Yeah. If you had to pull out 5 or 6 key themes around which we've learned a little bit about what works and what doesn't work, what would that be? Maybe we'll start with Shanaz and then go to Pranita.
Yeah, and I think Pranita can add on, I think one of the biggest lessons for me in terms of when we were sifting through this data and what was emerging was that multi-component approaches certainly were more successful in addressing violence, in childhoods. And I think,
can you say a little bit about what you mean by multi-component?
I'll explain a bit more, but I firstly want to just talk about the fact that, violence is such a complex area. And I think that in itself leans towards us really recognizing, when I talk about multi-component interventions, what I mean by that is that it's strategies that not only addresses one area, that you've got to think about the whole system that a child is, or that a school is composed of. So therefore, you've got to be thinking of it as an ecosystem, and you've got to be strategies that address both thinking about children themselves, so at an individual level, but also how they're embedded within the community as well as the school. And therefore, within that framework, we've got to be thinking about how we invest in structural changes within the school. So some of the programs we looked at had addressed policies. So for instance, if you're looking at corporal punishment, and particularly in the Global South, like in Africa, corporal punishment in schools are certainly widespread. And what we had seen is that investment in policies, improving policies, thinking about practices, as well as values within the school, all those are really, really important in terms of thinking about what needs to go into interventions. And one of the areas that we certainly, so if you think about bullying, for instance, which is widespread as well, that a bullying intervention on its own addressing children in schools won't work. But what we have found is that bullying interventions that work with both children and their parents and communities have a better chance to be successful. And therefore, one has to think about how within that scope as well, what we found is that not only multi-component, but certainly whole schools interventions that target the environment certainly has better chances of success. And there are a few examples that have really shown to be successful long-term in terms of whole schools approaches, where you're thinking about not just targeting your students, but all your learners in schools, but also your teachers, and thinking about how you promote a whole school-wide approach where it is also your governing bodies as well as your parents, and you think about the culture with school culture, as well as supporting teachers to, for instance, if you thinking about corporal punishment, how do you support teachers to use nonviolent forms of discipline within, not just developing a policy, because a policy, and we've seen this in South Africa, we've had corporal punishment legislation against corporal punishment in schools for more than 20 years. Yet surveys show that 50% of children in schools still experience corporal punishment. So policies on their own is not going to make a difference. It's about how you change the culture and behavior. And that's a challenge that we all face, but it has shown that it can make a difference. And therefore, the other kind of, characteristic of successful programs and what we've seen is that working with teachers in and supporting teachers in very short interventions can make a difference. And I think it's really, really critical that we think about how we engage teachers as well as learners and provide them with leadership roles that enable them to take on and shift practices and behavior. And there are a number of programs that have shown that this can make a difference. Pranita, do you want to add to that at all?
Thanks, Shanaz. I think you have already mentioned those very critical points. Just adding on to the other findings, what we actually found, apart from the need for programs to be multi-component and need for addressing the school culture, and it's not just sufficient to just engage with adolescent, but rather engage with the structure, given normative issues, norm and violence are very structural issue. And to address and prevent, we need to engage with and change the structure in that sense. Another finding that emerged was in terms of the approach of engaging. So like the thing that came up in most of the programs is that group-based learning was something which had worked out. One is that, in a school setting, that is something that is already happening. So students are learning in group setting. And so the programs had tried to use that setting and that culture for talking about the issues that, or the specific forms of violence or the normative issues that they were really addressing on. And what they found via the evaluation and the process documentation that were done is that actually the group-based education can impact behavior. It has the ability to empower learners and also build resilience in that sense. But what we also found from those reviews that, it's extremely critical to have safe spaces, even in the group setting. So it's not just enough to have group setting, but it's very crucial that this group setting is safe, where students can express themselves, can question without fear of being judged. And if there is a way to really use dissonance as an approach, and when I say dissonance as an approach, it really means that where students participate, like, not just participate, but also discuss and view a different or alternate perspective, where they, like, can learn that, okay, if I am thinking in this way, there are also alternate ways of looking and thinking about the same issues. And I think that process of creating safe spaces for students to articulate and express their opinion was extremely important in this group learning process. The another thing was that, group learning process also helped students, both young adolescent and older adolescent, to really build on their peer support, build on their collective experience and collective learning, that, if they are experiencing violence or discrimination, one is to learn that, it's not something that is in them, that's why they are experiencing, but rather seeing that it's actually the larger structural issue and the normative issues that are actually marginalizing them, and that's why they are experiencing. So that collective strength, and to also gain from that strength to raise questions as to why those things are happening and how those can be changed. So that was like one big learning that really emerged from most of the program. And it also raised a lot of question about, like, who should be the facilitator? What are the key skills that facilitators should come from? Because, we always need to also remember that in these programs within school, we are, while equipping adolescent, young and older adolescent, we are also have to equip teachers to move away from their current practices of teaching, which oftentimes is very patriarchal and power ridden. So that itself, it becomes extremely important part of this whole process. Yeah.
No, go on, finish your thought.
Yeah. Just another one I wanted to take up was this whole process of building or developing the program. And while when we begin the whole process, we felt that probably a lot of programs are coming from global north and being adapted in global south. But what actually we realized that almost 60% of the programs we reviewed were conceptualized and designed in global south. And the big strength these programs were built on is the contextual understanding of where it was being implemented. And those are extremely crucial for the success of the program. And we found that a lot of the program teams had really used formative research to design those programs. And that had really led to the grounding of such programs and contributed tremendously in their success. And even the programs which had come from global north, in the cases where it was really adapted based on the ground situation, their chances of success was much higher than those which were just replicated in global south. So that was another learning that we had. Yeah, Sinaz, do you want to add anything, any other point?
No, I think you've covered that well, but I think Deepak had something to add.
No, so, there's so much you guys have put here on this one slide that I want to explore many points. And I just want to let our listeners and people who are participating in this webinar know that we've reserved some time for Q&A at the end. So please do send in your questions, both panelists and any reflections that you might have on what you hear. Yeah. So these 6 key themes that you've identified, even if you take the first 2, let's start with the first 2 first, right? That, as you said that, you started with the understanding that, children don't live on islands, that their lives are connected through many systems, that at school, their parents, they live in communities, and so forth. So can you talk a little bit about the importance of if you are a program person and you are designing an interventions, why it's so important to think about the complexity of influences that come towards children and that determines how they experience life and how they respond to life around them, right? That you said multi-component interventions are really important. Can you talk about why so? Yeah, so that how they build on each other to build a lasting, sustainable outcome.
Yeah, complex, Deepak. And I think, I started off by saying that violence is complex, and it's precisely for that reason, because if we think about, and I like to think about a life course approach to violence, that children's exposure to violence isn't once off. It's often through multiple exposures in multiple settings. And when we think about developing interventions, we've got to be thinking about, and if the aim is to prevent violence or prevent, perpetration or further victimization, you've got to be thinking about how you target those risks and improve protective factors for children. And therefore it becomes critical that your interventions think about reducing risk, and therefore you've got to think about what is it within the school. So Pranita spoke about creating safe spaces for children in schools, but creating safe spaces for children in schools isn't enough. if you live, so if I take South Africa where I live in, and some of our communities have gang violence, just stepping out of that school, it's not going to be safe. So you've got to be thinking about how you create an intervention that then interfaces with all the risks that the child could be exposed to in its life. It's the home, it's the community, and therefore interventions have to be thinking about, do we include multiple stakeholders like your religious leaders, depending on the communities who are, and I think in some ways one has to do a mapping of who are the most important stakeholders that need to be included in an intervention if it needs to be multi-component, because that the comprehensive approach certainly has better outcomes, and that's what we've seen in this review, by taking into account how you think about reducing risk and increasing protective factors for children, and therefore working with all those elements in the child's ecosystem creates a better chance for success.
And then build on to it.
Sorry.
Yeah, so then build on to it that if you conceptualize the problem where that, there are multiple things that influence the entire school, meaning everybody surrounding the child needs to respond and act, right? So you can't have interventions that are just targeting one group of duty bearers or actors, right? That everybody has to be brought on board to respond to this issue.
Exactly, and we've seen in some of the interventions that have been implemented where an intervention targets children, it comes in, so an agency or program comes in and it's totally from outside, not including your principals, your teachers, or the community. And those are the programs that have the least success because there's no buy-in from the school to be supporting the program itself. It's an add-on, it's not integrated, and therefore the chances of it being sustainable afterwards also is minimal. And one has to be thinking about all of this in when you design interventions, because it has to be sustainable beyond the life of an outside agency coming in. So how do you integrate it into the life of that school?
So, Pranita, did you want to add anything? I want to ask you questions about some of the things that you said too, but did you want to add anything that Shinaz was saying?
Yeah, just one point I wanted to say. So while I totally agree with the points Shinaz brought in about the whole ecosystem, and we also recognize that school is one institution of socialization. There are so many other factors. I think what we really need to also see that this is one component. So what we are talking about is investing in programming, and school is that one important space without discounting on other programs that need to be engaging with the other stakeholders. So this is part of the larger solutioning that we need to think about. And within school, every stakeholder need to be engaged, and school as an institution, as a system, we need to work on. So while building perspective and skill of individual students, it's important to work with teachers, but without missing out on that teachers are also working in a system which itself is patriarchal, and that also need to be changed. So that sort of holistic approach we need to keep.
Yeah, no, I think that is crucial that both of you are saying, right? That any solutions that we bring to the table have to be integrated and have to be woven into the lives of people who are already there, right? And multiple things are existing there already. So we can't just ignore everything that is happening and just focus on our solution, right? That's why, for example, some of the earlier interventions around just focusing on preventing corporal punishment and nothing else. Yeah, important as that work is, it's not sustainable to just do one thing and ignore everything else, because life doesn't work. Yeah? Let me follow up with one of the things that you said, Pranita, that no matter how carefully thought through your intervention is, maybe you even have a lot of evidence base behind it in terms of evaluation, things like, if you don't have frontline people who understand the context of children that are going to experience this intervention, it can easily fall flat. It can easily become irrelevant because it's not contextual and adapted. Can you say a little bit more about why that is so important?
So, the thing is that what we looked at all the review and just the experience from here, that, unless a program, so let's take a specific example. If I share with you, there are programs which has very nicely elaborated on the process of implementation, which I must say that many of the programs and the reports, especially peer-reviewed journals, have missed out on. The thing is that, so if a program is happening outside the school hours, suppose, led by an external facilitator, they have identified that there are lot of barriers in terms of participation. So like, girls who had more, like, household chores to attend to, parents were not allowing them to stay more longer than the school hour. And so it was very difficult for them to participate. Or even, schools were not like, keen on taking any responsibility of if things are happening beyond school hours. So that type of thing actually affected the participation of students, particularly girls. And, the thing is that when a program is designed to engage both girls and boys, and not really recognizing the marginalization of girls in many contexts, then, I mean, in a way, we are further marginalizing them and excluding them from the program. So really having that understanding of the context and the barriers, the risk factors, really affects a lot. So same way, like when we are talking about teachers, now if our program has not been investing sufficiently in building perspective and skills of teachers, and if teachers continue to practice the way they were doing earlier, how is that going to really address violence or promote gender equality? So those are really crucial. And, we have been working with teachers, and we realize that changing, building gender lens, making teachers aware of the power they and the privileges they have, and that how those have adverse effect on students, it's extremely difficult for them to recognize, to practice in their life, because there is also some level of fear that comes in, that, what will happen if they lose those power. So it's really important to recognize, invest, and provide those support even to those stakeholders whom we really expect them to change for good, and then enable young people to bring those transformation. So this transformational journey that we expect these frontline people to take on, they have to understand the issues, and then only they can move before taking others on that journey. So that's been
So then, Pranita, in mention as to we're asking something big from teachers and adults around this who are implementing that, right? That both of you are saying that, children's lives are complicated, and children are really skilled problem solvers, in the sense that they encounter a situation and very quickly they figure out what works, what will work and what will not work, right? And so if we try to say something or say, hey, do this or do that, they might be compliant, but they won't take it on as a behavior change. So one of the things, Pranita, you said, and I think, Shinaz, you mentioned this too, is that, we have to help build capacity of teachers, and that we're asking them to rethink their relationship with children, and then you talked a little bit about this transformational journey. We've all inherited that adults should behave in certain ways towards children, and here we are asking them to re-examine those things, change some of the ways in which they think of children. Can you speak a little bit about what are we asking from teachers, yeah, and adults generally who are running schools and who are caregivers to children? What are some of the things that we're asking from them and the kinds of capacity we need to build in them? Because you've identified that as one of the successful strategies, right?
Yeah, my sense is, Deepak, that we're asking quite a lot of teachers and principals, administrators at schools. We actually asking them to change fundamentally how they've been, been as teachers and educators. But that also goes to just generally, so Pranita's been talking about transformational work. But if we're thinking about violence, it is about thinking about power and changing the power dynamics. And the challenge is really that we've got to be working with teachers, educators, school governing bodies to think about relationships with children, to be thinking about how you change that. And it's not just within the school environment, but it's also within personal relationships. So I think, some of what we're talking about here is transformational work at a very personal level. And what we have seen in the programs that have worked is that, targeting your teachers is really, really critical and providing them. So I think one of the lessons we've also learned is that you cannot expect teachers to do this work without giving them the necessary support. So kind of tools and bolstering them to enable them to do that and support them through the process. We've also seen that gender comes in. And the gender of teachers doing particular types of work. So it's really critical for us to be thinking very strategically around the transformation work that is required to enable us, our teachers and learners, to be able to then engage in this kind of work. So I think, the kind of transformational work we're talking about is really digging deep, firstly, in one's own power and issues of, and then that translates to how you then are within your, as an educator within your school, and understanding the power you have in terms of being an educator. So we're asking a lot of teachers, but I think, it's a transformational journey at a very personal level that you're going to take with you beyond just the school. It's going to touch every part of your life. Pranita, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, thank you, Shanaz. And I always feel that one can teach 2 + 2 = 4 even without believing it, but no one can actually teach issues of gender and violence without believing in it. And I remember once one of the teachers had shared during one of the meetings that, when she was the session was happening on violence, different forms of violence and cycle of violence. Though, and it's her words. She said that, while students were not saying, but I could read on their face that she's actually saying that first look at your own behavior before teaching us. And that was really powerful. And it's very important, the point that Shanaz, you said, without connecting with self, this transformation, this realization and transformation is just not possible. And that is core and critical for the violence prevention initiatives we are talking about, the approach we are talking about.
So let me try to connect both of the things that you're saying, right? That say if I am a listener and I'm thinking about developing interventions, one of the things I might wonder is that this is really good and really nice, and I see the idea, but is it possible to do this in practice, right? That transforming people, asking of teachers that, we should really reimagine our relationship. Is it possible to do at a practical level at scale? Yeah, that it might be nice, I can do it in one school, but can you do it in 1,000 schools? What would you say to that practitioner who is worrying about those kinds of things?
Deepak, the few programs that we have seen that have been taken, beyond just, pilots, and it has happened. So, I mean, you've worked on the Good Schools program in Uganda, and we've seen that it is possible. Pranita's worked on GEMS in India, and this is possible, but it needs sustained approaches. It requires investment. And I want to talk to the fact that we have not had sufficient investment. If we think of the numbers of children that are attending school on a daily basis, more than 1 billion. It is such an important aspect of creating an enabling environment and a safe environment, is to be investing in this kind of work in and through schools, yet we haven't seen sufficient investment. We've seen piecemeal programs that have not been sustained because there hasn't been sustained funding for it. And I think, we've got to be thinking about how we create these partnerships to allow for sustained interventions. And for me, this is the critical thing, that we've got good ideas, but a good idea will fall flat if we cannot sustain it. And the way to sustain it is by integrating it into schools, by getting departments of education on board, by including whole societies in our approaches. And that will allow for it to be taken to scale very organically, because it cannot be an artificial exercise.
Anita, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I think, and one more point I just wanted to add on this, that we need to look at what is the cost of violence that every day, every month, every year we are experiencing. How critical gender equality is, not only just as a goal in itself, but also means to achieve many other sustainable development goals. Are we investing sufficiently to even recover these unnecessary costs that we are bearing day by day, month by month? And even if we are able to invest only a portion of these costs, I think we can achieve so much. So I agree with what Sana said. Yes, it's possible. It's necessary to do, and that we need to make necessary investment and commitment to towards achieving this.
I think both of you are saying some really important things, right? That we need to invest in this problem. One, that it's doable, that there are examples of this thing that has been done to scale. And in a minute, there's a couple of questions about those examples, so I'll come to it in a minute. But one of the things that I think implicit in what both of you are saying is that education sector needs to own this problem as well, right? So right now, violence against children is often seen as it's a problem that started from home and communities, and the school is just grappling with it, but it's not really a problem that was created by school. But by virtue of the fact that children spend long hours at school, right, it is a school's problem. And therefore, people who are planning education policy and education investments should consider violence against children at school as an important component and a problem for which there needs to be a solution. Yeah, because that means that there is then systemic investment in solution of that problem. So there are a couple of, before I ask you to then reflect on all the things that you've said in terms of focus, so what are we walking away from and what do you want participants to walk away with from here? There are a couple of questions that I wanted to put to you. The first question is that, how are there any examples and do you have thoughts on how to engage parents and what is the role of parents in creating safer schools? Yeah. And so let's start with that question. I don't know if either one of you want to engage with that question. Or John too. John, you might have, Haki Alim has done a lot of work, so you might want to engage too. John, do you want to go first?
Well, basically, yes, there has been a lot of interventions that have been engaging parents. And if we want to be successful in terms of addressing violence against children, you cannot do without involving parents. Because as we have had, and this is actually is happening everywhere, that the violence against children do not happen only at school, but on the way to school, and also at the school level, and also at home. So we need the whole community to be involved in terms of addressing violence against children. We have seen a couple of interventions in Tanzania which have been successfully, but the secret behind the success that we had a lot of support from the parents and from the community. So engaging the parents is very important. And I just want to also to say that there's a couple of questions on the Q&A section. So I think as we move on, we should spend some time to quickly go through them and pick those which we can, so that Shanaz and Pranita could respond to them. Otherwise, you can proceed, Deepak. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Shanaz, Pranita, do you want to talk about the importance of involving parents and how?
Yeah, my sense is from the review, it's really critical to involve parents, because if you don't involve parents, you're not going to get a sustained effect of a program. And I think for me, the critical part, I've just had a power outage here. My electricity's gone off, but I think my Wi-Fi remains stable. So yeah, I think it's for, as we've said, you know, you've got to be thinking about your whole system, and therefore parent engagement becomes critical. As children are exposed to programs, you've got to take your parents along the journey as well, else you're not going to have the sustained effect of your program. And I think that for us is probably the lesson that we've learned from the review. Pranita, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think you have already said that. There are certain examples of programs which has worked on good parenting. One can look at those. But I think there are still questions on the sustainability, especially when this is a community program, mostly the programs are owned by and executed by organizations without a clear linkage with specific community-based platforms. So which creates a lot of issues in terms of sustaining those efforts. So that's definitely one gap that one should really look for. But there are certain examples, and I don't think anybody would disagree with the point on the need to engage parents in the whole process. But I think we really need to look at what are the specific platforms available, because, you know, for example, in India, there is the school management committees, which includes parents, but that number is very small. Those are like, it doesn't really engage all parents whose children are in the school. So we really need to think what are the best mechanism and platforms for sustained engagement of parents. So that's definitely one area I feel we need more evidence on.
Right. And in many of the interventions, the encouragement is that think of school as an entry point for addressing this problem, right? But it's not the end point only, right? That you start from the school, and then in the ecosystem that you're talking about, that you go in concentric circles around the schools, community around the schools, church and mosques and temples and other institutions around the schools, and all the way till home. Yeah, because it's like a course of antibiotics, right? You can't just give half of it and then expect that the problem is solved. You have to do the full course for the problem to be solved. Another question that is come from several of our participants is that, are there examples of multi-component interventions that have worked, and where can they find them? Do you want to talk about what you saw in your analysis? And I know we have a whole webinar, that next webinar is about successful programs.
Pranita, do you want to take the lead on just talking through this? Because, yeah.
Yeah, so just briefly, there are examples of programs which have worked on the multiple stakeholders, whole school approach, and has shown, so like, you know, what we have tried to see, just a broader comparison as to the what's the level of success of the programs which has been multi-stakeholder, and those which have just focused on one specific, maybe on student skill building. And what we have found in the way it's been conceptualized, situated, and analyzed, that the multi-stakeholder programs, while being very complex, also had a lot of challenges. They have been able to be more successful in bringing change in the school environment, in addition to the changes in the among the students. So that type of thing that we have seen in our review. And I'll request everyone, if they can really go look at the report. It has details, specific programs, brief of specific programs. And I just also wanted to mention that, you know, in our on our website, we have also tried to create the database of those programs in the reports, where you can actually access more information. So, but there are programs which have shown results and like, you know, usefulness of having multi-stakeholder programming.
Great. And then in the chat box, we will put the link to the website, the coalitionforgoodschools.org, where you can find this report and also the database of the programs. Yeah. The other question that is kind of a lot is people want to know where they can access some of this information and references. And so again, I think we should refer people to our website and then watch this space. In terms of examples of successful programs, next webinar, we're inviting you to come and join us again. That will be announced, and then John will talk a little bit about when that is. It's in July. And there we will talk a little bit with the key practitioners who are leading those programs to what worked for them and how did they do it. So stay tuned on that. So in the last like 7 or 8 minutes that we have, I wanted to now move to a little bit that, you know, starting with Pranita and Shanaz, but John, you know, I'll come to you as well. That, you know, you've done this really thoughtful, rigorous piece of work, yeah, of looking at what is going on, who is doing what, and what is success. What did you learn from it? What should people who are listening to this learn from it in terms of what are you walking away with? Any reflections that you have as a result of doing this exercise?
Shall I start? I think for me, Deepak, one of the most important lessons is that we've got to remember that pathways to change isn't linear. And therefore, the development of interventions and programs are certainly iterative, that they develop over time, but most importantly, that the partnership with practitioners are often not documented. And that's so critical, because without practitioners, you know, we're not going to have successful interventions, because the practitioners are implement. They are closer to the ground than us as researchers, and therefore their insights are really valuable in shaping interventions and guiding intervention development. And I really think that what we are lacking is thinking about how we develop communities of practice to be learning from each other. Because my sense is that, you know, sharing is a critical way, like we're doing today, how the task of violence prevention is huge. And it's only by sharing lessons that we learn that we're able to really make the impact that we need to have. And I would urge us to think about how we move forward by developing those kinds of communities of practice that enable us to learn from each other.
Anita, do you have reflections?
Yeah. So one side is about the need for building more evidence, especially the point Shanaz mentioned about what is the pathways of change. So far, we have focused more on the, okay, this is the package, intervention package, and this is the result. But what is it that really leading to? What is the trajectory that people or group of people have taken to reach to that change? That still is very unclear. And there's a need to invest in capturing, understanding that part of the process. That is one definitely important. The another one is that, even with the evidence that are available, there is still this whole issue of school as a critical space for violence prevention in school and through school. That whole agenda is still not really been highlighted enough, and because of that, we are seeing the type of investment very minimal, especially from global south. So I feel that this the coalition that we are together, I think we need to expand that coalition to bring more voices, more experiences, to really set the agenda and to move the agenda, and really bring the attention on investing on this issue. I think this is high time. We need to pull our efforts together to make this a real issue for everyone, for the people with resources, with paycheck, to recognize and invest on. So that's my take.
Thank you. No, I think both of you are making really important points, right? And then I think that this is a really thoughtful and profound piece of work that you guys have done. And here are some of the things that I am walking away. That one, a lot is going on in the global south around the issue of preventing violence against children in schools. It's just that we who are working in the global south have not been very good at articulating and documenting that work in a way in which it gets noticed. Yeah. So in some ways, we do have to create a community of practice where we share this work, where we develop impetus and discipline in each other to document our work and share with others and talk about our ideas and get critiqued by each other, community of practice, so that people then feel that there's people who are interested in this work and need to have. The third thing I'm kind of walking away from here is that the point that both of you made is that the practitioners on the front line are really important. People who are on the ground implementing these ideas and day-to-day encountering the problems and hurdles that they are solving are crucial. They are not just the end product, but they are the drivers of how we solve these problems. Yeah, and so we need to invest in them. And what Pranita, you and Shanaz both said is that we need to bring funding so that these people are not struggling to just, do this on a voluntary basis, but this is a profession, that this is something that you do and you get paid for it, so that, in some ways you can apply bandwidth to. Yeah. And then the final point that I wanted to make is that there are many examples. We have ideas, that we now know are beginning to get directions in terms of what works. And there are many examples. You guys have identified 20 programs that are really promising and is worth investing in terms of developing them. And there are many others that we might not have missed, right? So there are ideas there, and there are people who are leading this. We need to now get momentum behind folks in Global South. And that Global South is where majority of children live and go to school. Yeah. So in some ways, we have important contribution to make